Guys, I'm back for chapter 3 in our new read aloud called Gooseberry Park. And in this chapter, we're going to learn a little bit more about Professor Albert. And that is the man that is Kona's owner. And he also owns Gwendolyn. So this kind of talks about how they came to live with Professor Albert. Okay, so this chapter is called Friends, and it's chapter 3. Kona had been born in the family room of a fifth-grade teacher on Paradise Lane. Stumpy had been born in a sugar maple near the south entrance of Gooseberry Park. And Gwendolyn had been born in a palm tree on an island somewhere in the Caribbean. It was a miracle that the three of them had ever found each other. Of course, this was mostly Professor Albert's doing. He was a retired biology professor who loved to grow daylilies and listen to the saxophone. Professor Albert had never married. He liked living alone, and all the years he was a professor, he never minded the fact that he had no family. He was too busy teaching the cell structures of amphibians. But after he retired and found himself home so much of the time, he began to grow a little lonely. And when he started talking back to the radio, "Oh, yes, I love outpatient care too," he realized he needed a pet. So he bought himself a hermit crab. She was the loveliest of all the crabs in the pet store. Her shell was creamy white with wavy brown lines flowing across it. She was quite big, twice the size of the other crabs, and Professor Albert found her enchanting. So he brought her home from the store in a little paper box, named her Gwendolyn, and became her friend. Gwendolyn turned out to be a wonderful companion. Professor Albert carried her bowl from room to room in his house, depending on what needed doing. If he was in the kitchen baking banana bread, Gwendolyn was on the kitchen counter. If he was in the living room watching television, Gwendolyn was on the coffee table. If he was writing letters in his study, Gwendolyn was on his desk. Professor Albert knew that Gwendolyn liked him because she always pulled her head far out of her shell to look at him when he talked to her. "Gwendolyn, did you know that each giraffe's markings are unique?" As the professor spoke, Gwendolyn's delicate antenna moved gracefully back and forth, and he knew she was listening carefully. Having been a teacher, he was quite good at picking out careful listeners. It was nice having her. So here's a picture, and this is Professor Albert mixing something up in the kitchen. And of course, Gwendolyn is in there with him because he moves her bowl. Wherever he goes in the house, he moved her bowl with him, along with him, so that she could be right there with him, whatever he was doing. Professor Albert was very happy with his hermit crab, and he had no plans to get a dog. He didn't know he needed a dog. He had never even thought about it. But one day, one of his neighbors who had a sister who had a son in the fifth-grade class of a woman who lived on Paradise Lane told Professor Albert about the teacher's brand new litter of puppies. 12 in all! 12! The professor could not imagine so many puppies. He tried imagining 12 hermit crabs. So many bowls to carry. How did anyone manage 12 puppies? His neighbor said that the puppies were chocolate Labradors. Chocolate Labradors? The professor imagined children finding these instead of chocolate rabbits in their Easter baskets. The neighbor said the puppies were round like beach balls and that they loved to play. They played and played and played. And when Professor Albert heard this, something lit up inside of him. Something from when he was a boy. It had to do with dogs and playing. And before he knew it, he was telling his neighbor, I would like to have one of those puppies. So Professor Albert found himself in the family room of a fifth grade teacher on Paradise Lane, with 12 fat little puppies running all over him and all over each other and all over everything else in the room. He was delighted and overwhelmed and could hardly catch his breath. And he wondered how he would ever choose just one puppy from so many. They all looked pretty much the same. Should he just pick one up and go? But as he was trying to figure all of this out, one of the happy puppies crawled into his lap and stayed. It stayed and stayed and stayed. The other puppies romped across him, licked his face, then ran off somewhere else. But this puppy stayed. The fifth grade teacher said to Professor Albert, of them all, that's the one who likes to be held the most. He likes company. He'll be glad when he's the only puppy somewhere. Professor Albert smiled. He knew all about liking company, and this little puppy was staying. He took the puppy home. He named him Kona after his favorite type of coffee. And there in the house, Kona grew up. So this is the picture in the book now of Professor Albert, and he goes to this house of this fifth grade teacher, and there's 12 puppies running all around. And he's nervous and he's kind of not really sure what to do because he doesn't know how to pick which puppy to keep. But one of the puppies jumps up on his lap and just stays there with him. So it kind of made his decision for him. This little puppy, maybe this was just meant to be. So that's how he picked Kona. And he took the puppy home and he named the puppy Kona because that's his favorite kind of coffee. Of course, Gwendolyn and Kona became best friends right away. Though Professor Albert couldn't understand Gwendolyn's language, Kona could. And very quickly, Gwendolyn assumed the job of puppy training. So remember, that's the hermit crab. Gwendolyn is the hermit crab. So she is helping to train Kona. So these are some things that she says to him. No, Kona dear, you are not allowed to chew Professor Albert's slippers. No, Kona dear, dogs do not eat encyclopedias. No, Kona dear, you must wait until you are outside to do that. Do you want to go outside? Then sit at the door and bark for Professor Albert. That's right, bark. Kona did everything Gwendolyn told him to do. And Professor Albert said to everyone that raising a puppy was the easiest job in the whole world. This amused Gwendolyn very much. So who was really doing the training? Was it Gwendolyn or Professor Albert? Gwendolyn is the one helping to train Kona. But because Professor Albert can't understand their language, he doesn't know that. It was a few years more before Kona met the little red squirrel named Stumpy. Gooseberry Park was a very large park with many trees and many more squirrels. And to Kona, of course, all of the squirrels looked alike. Kona went to the park every day with Professor Albert, and while the professor read books about snails and baboons and ants and lilies, listening to Charlie Parker on his Walkman, Kona explored the park and ignored the squirrels. Then one day, as he was exploring, Kona came upon a little red squirrel who was trying to pull a plastic toy tractor up a tree. Holding the tractor in her teeth, the little squirrel pulled it halfway up the tree trunk, but the tractor slipped and crashed to the ground. She ran down to the bottom to start all over again. Kona walked over to speak to her. Perhaps if you pushed it, he suggested, as the squirrel began pulling up the tractor yet again. The squirrel opened her mouth. What? The tractor crashed. Oops, said Kona, sorry. The little squirrel ran down to try once more. It's for my collection, she said to the dog. I haven't anything this big. Do you know what it's called? A tractor. I've seen them on television, Kona answered. Television? Asked the squirrel. Kona sometimes forgot the world really did have wild animals in it. He couldn't imagine anyone not knowing what a television was. Never mind, said Kona. I simply suggest that you push it. Put your paws on the back and roll it up the tree, just like a boy would. Good idea, said the squirrel, and she pushed the toy tractor all the way up the tree trunk and into her nest. She disappeared inside and was gone for several minutes. Kona started to walk away. I'm Stumpy. The squirrel's little red head popped out of her nest just as the dog was leaving. I'm Kona, called the Labrador, happily turning back. What else do you collect? So here is when Kona and Stumpy met at Gooseberry Park. And there's the little tractor that Stumpy was trying to get up into her nest in the tree. And Kona's giving her some suggestions on how to do that. So this is how when they first met. And that is how Kona and Stumpy met. He visited her tree every time Professor Albert took a park bench nap, which was quite often. And from Stumpy, he heard tales of life in Gooseberry Park, which he reported back to Gwendolyn, who commented on them, as most elderly animals will. Leave it to a raccoon to make a mess of things. Oh, yes, indeed, crows are quite the smart Alex. There's nothing like a young possum to warm the heart. Thank goodness for rabbits. So all of those things are comments that Gwendolyn would say. So Kona goes to the park and talks to Stumpy, and then he comes home and he tells Gwendolyn all about it, and Gwendolyn says all these kind of things back. She loves listening to all the stories. These comments Kona took back to Stumpy, and in this way, they all became friends. It was a fine life, a life just right for babies. And that is the end of chapter 3. So that's the way that Kona and Stumpy and Gwendolyn have all become friends. So Kona goes to the park, talks to Stumpy, goes back home, tells Gwendolyn all about it, and then Kona goes back to the park and tells Stumpy things that Gwendolyn has said. So they all kind of have become friends, even though Gwendolyn and Stumpy have never really been around each other. Kona kind of goes back and forth and talks to each one of them and kind of fills in the other one on what's going on. So that was chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed it.